Lynley Dumble is the Acting Director of Community Wellbeing at Brimbank Council. Lynley has extensive experience working in local government and has held senior positions over the last decade at Brimbank Council and Brimbank City Council. Today, Lynley will help set the scene by offering some insights into the Brimbank perspective, including Council's efforts to promote social justice and the local impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you, Lynley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yes, my name's Lynley Dumble. I'm the Acting Director of Community Wellbeing at Brimbank City Council. Before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which Brimbank sits, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are part of this meeting today. In this short presentation, I'll provide some background on the Budget Forum and its role within Council on our work on promoting social justice. Also provide an overview of the local impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and Council's response over the past few months. I'll also outline some of the key local highlights and gaps that came out of the 2020-21 state and federal budgets. Brooke's going to be managing the slides, so I'm sure we'll be as seamless as possible in getting through this. So thank you, everyone. Council has been hosting the Budget Forum since 2014 in conjunction with the Social Justice Coalition. The forum provides an opportunity to consider how state and federal government budget and policy impacts Brimbank. As we know, there has been a delay with budget announcements because of COVID. So normally we hold this event, in the middle of the year. So we've had to wait till the end of the year to actually do this important event. The forum provides an opportunity to consider how state and federal government budgets and policy impact Brimbank. It also provides and informs our broader advocacy and planning, including the COVID-19 response and recovery strategy and the 19-point action plan, as well as transforming Brimbank advocacy priorities and the 2050 vision. In addition, this year's forum is particularly timely given the recent election of our new council, and welcome councillors that are here today. We've already heard from our mayor. And also the significant challenges we face in our efforts to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll come to these shortly. So, why is social justice important in Brimbank? The current Brimbank Social Justice Charter was adopted by Council in 2018. However, it continues Council's long-standing commitment to social justice and human rights, which dates way back to 2008. It also formalises Council's aim to create a more just society where difference does not lead to disadvantage. The Social Justice Coalition is the key local stakeholder group which brings together organisations and individuals with a shared interest in social justice. And I'd like to thank all those participants from our Social Justice Coalition for joining today and also helping shape today's event. The Coalition's Strategic Implementation Group is chaired by a councillor and includes representation from a range of service providers and agencies. Many of the members are here with us today, as well as our previous Chair and Deputy Chair, Councillor Virginia Tarkos and also Councillor Virginia Borg, who were both re-elected in the current council elections. As you can see from the slide, Brimbank is one of the most culturally diverse communities in Australia. Hope everyone can see some of those figures. For instance, 48% of residents in Brimbank were born overseas. That's an incredible amount of diversity that we have. Also, there are over 160 different languages spoken in Brimbank. And 75% of our residents identify with a faith or religion. We are also, unfortunately, the second most disadvantaged municipality in Greater Melbourne. Council values this diversity and its role in making Brimbank a vibrant and successful community, and the diversity is actually one of our huge strengths. But it's important for us to also understand the disadvantage and also the potential discrimination that can cause for our community. We also know that the fact that we have such significant pockets of disadvantage, that this was actually one of the main things that affected Brimbank disproportionately around the COVID-19 pandemic. As many people will be aware, Brimbank actually at one point was a hotspot for COVID cases, and that, I think, actually highlighted and put a strong lens on the fact that in most of the parts of Melbourne where there was high disadvantage, they were the most hardest hit and affected by COVID. This forum can help us identify how well state and federal governments are responding to COVID-19 and inform Council's planning and advocacy priorities into the near future. Thanks, Brooke. The impact of COVID-19 and unemployment. 2020 has seen Brimbank and the world confronted by the global pandemic, which has caused widespread health, wellbeing and economic harm. As I mentioned before, much of the disadvantage experience in Brimbank has been compounded by COVID-19 pandemic. We know that we have a higher rate of unemployment, 9.4%, higher than the Western region and Victoria. The unemployment extends beyond 10% in several of our neighbourhoods, including St Albans, Keeks Park, Sunshine North and Sunshine West. Notably, we expect these figures to get worse by the September and December quarters as a result of the second lockdown. The impact of COVID-19 on job seekers. Thanks, Brooke. We can see the impact of unemployment flowing through in terms of job seeker recipients, formerly known as Newstart. Between March and October 2020, the proportion of Brimbank residents receiving Jobseeker almost doubled from 7.1% to 13.6%. This translates to more than 9,000 additional people receiving Jobseeker since early 2020. This trend has been relatively constant across the municipality, with figures now exceeding 17% in some neighbourhoods, for example, St Albans and Kings Park. With such high numbers, the debate around maintaining high levels of job seeker is particularly relevant in Brimbank. Thanks, Brooke. Our residents have been seeking support for a range of issues during the pandemic. In August 2020, Council surveyed 71 organisations regarding the demand for services and support. The results reveal that the pandemic has had detrimental impact on mental health, social connections and family relationships. And you can see the highest number seeking assistance is actually in that mental health field, around 68.7%, as well as isolation and loneliness. We know this was a huge impact in our municipality and continues to be. There is also increased demand for material aid and emergency relief, housing and income support. Thank you, Brooke. So, Council's response to COVID-19. Since the very early days of the pandemic, Council has been supporting our community in many ways, including sharing information about the pandemic and the virus and how to prevent transmission and keep healthy and safe, supporting a number of testing sites in Brimbank with the state government, maintaining contact with vulnerable residents, transitioning so many of our programs and services to online to support people while they were isolating at home during the restrictions, and also supporting our local businesses and sporting clubs. Council's response has been formalised into these two key documents, and these are both available on Council's website. The Coronavirus Response and Recovery Strategy, as well as our 19-point action plan for COVID response and recovery, which highlights our advocacy around this issue to state and federal government. Thanks, Brooke. Just going back to the strategy, it was actually adopted by Council firstly in April 2020. And we do monthly progress reports to Council, including some of the data that I've just presented today. We're currently working in the organisation with others to be able to review this document to see what our, I guess, next stage of supporting the community during recovery will be in 2020 and beyond. So for budget highlights, I'll briefly outline some highlights from the state and federal budget. There were many other announcements with indirect and potential benefit to Brimbank, but I'll leave these to be discussed by Emma in the breakout discussions. Our local highlights include the Melbourne Airport Rail Link. It has now been confirmed that the Melbourne Airport Rail Link will run via Sunshine, which provides long-term foundation for social and economic development. The suburban rail loop, which will be the state government has allocated funding to start the project, will ultimately include a new transport hub at Sunshine. Mental health, the state government has allocated funding to provide additional mental health beds at Sunshine Hospital, which will go some way to meeting current and forecast demand. Open space, state government funding has allocated funding for upgrades to visitor facilities and playgrounds, including Organ Pipes National Park and Brimbank Park, which is a very welcome investment. Next slide. We also know that there's going to be school upgrades up to 56.8 million over 4 years, which will be at 7 locations in Brimbank. 30 million for the Western Rail Plan as part of the 1.1 billion for priority road and rail projects in Victoria. And also 25.1 million over 4 years for an upgrade and expansion of the Sunshine Law Courts. There will also be 16.8 million to install traffic signals at the Melton Highway, Sunshine Avenue, Old Calder intersection at Taylor's Lakes. No budget is perfect, and we have time to discuss some of the gaps later. However, I'll just highlight some prominent gaps. St Albans Health and Wellbeing Hub, Council is currently building a new health and wellbeing hub at St Albans to replace the former St Albans Leisure Centre. That's a $60 million project, and we were very happy to receive $2 million from the state government, which was announced this year. However, there hasn't been any further allocation from the state or federal government to that project. However, we will continue to keep advocating. The local shovel-ready projects, no dedicated funding was provided in these budget announcements. And for Jobseeker, there were further cuts to the rate of Jobseeker, and no announcement has been made on a permanent rate. So there will be plenty of time in today's session to talk a bit more around those gaps. So thanks again for attending today. We look forward to our guest speakers and small group discussions. As I mentioned, your input today is going to be very valuable for Council to be able to help us with reviewing our COVID-19 response and recovery strategy. Also importantly, feeding into the development of the next Council plan, which will run from 2021 to 2025, as well as updating our community vision, which is our long-term community plan. I will now pass back to Jason to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynley. We now have the first of two of our special guest speakers from outside of Brimbank. The first of those being Wade Noonan, who will be known to many of you as the former member of Victoria's Legislative Assembly. For 11 years, between 2007 and 2018, Wade held some of the most challenging and complex policy and political ministries of government, including for police and corrections between 2014 and 16, and more recently as Minister for Industry, Employment and Resources in 2016 to 17. Wade was universally recognised and respected for his integrity and his professionalism. Since leaving Parliament, Wade has balanced his time across a number of significant roles, including at RMIT Uni, where he's the Associate Director of Social Enterprise and Investment, and also at WAmea, the West of Melbourne Economic Development Alliance, where he's Executive Director. And it's in that capacity that Wade will be speaking with us today. In addition, he currently serves on a number of boards and advisory groups in the public health and not-for-profit sectors, including with Jobseeker and Western Bulldogs Community Foundation. He's the #1 ticket holder for the Williamstown Football Club and an ambassador for the Indigenous Marathon Foundation. Please welcome Wade, who will talk about the bigger picture for Brimbank and the Western region today, including some of the opportunities that are expected to flow from the Northwest City deal. Welcome to you, Wade.
Thanks, Jason, for that very warm and fine and long introduction. It makes me feel a bit old when you run through all of that, and I'm glad you mentioned my involvement with the Indigenous Marathon Foundation, which is something very close to my heart, so it's an appropriate place to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, as others have during this session, and pay my respects to any elders that might be with us. And step us into my presentation. Before I get into the detail, I just want to congratulate Brimbank City Council and stakeholders today. Look, it's been a difficult year, but I've watched with some admiration in relation to the way the Brimbank City Council have provided this wonderful level of leadership through their officers and their councillors and mayor and CEOs. So in particular around the COVID response, but also maintaining a very strong focus on social justice and inclusion, which is absolutely appropriate, not just in Brimbank, but across Melbourne's West, and also crafting a really exciting vision for Brimbank going forward. We understand that there are lots of challenges, but they've also got a very strong and positive view about the future. And what I want to present to you today is something that I've been working on with a number of stakeholders across Melbourne's North and West to carve out, you know, a longer term vision for our region, being Melbourne's West from 2020 to 2040. And I'll explain why we've done this work. But before I step into it, I did see that one of my colleagues, Sue LaGreca from Lead West, who's been really quite critical to the creation of this document, is also with us this morning. So a special shout out to Sue LaGreca. Brooke's also helping me with the slides. So I'm going to get Brooke to take us to the second slide, which is really what the outline of my presentation is today. That is, who is WAmea? What is a city deal? I'll give you a bit of background to it and tell you how we've structured our governance to prepare this particular proposal. I'll talk to you about the scope, some of the transformational projects in Melbourne's West. I'll touch on Sunshine, given the audience today. I'll talk to you about the launch, which many of you might have seen, and the key messages we used and what the budget has yielded recently and where we might be going from here. Next slide. Thanks, Brooke. So, who is WAmea? Well, up until 2017, we actually didn't have a regional grouping in Melbourne's West just focusing on economic development and jobs. Now, I know this seems quite extraordinary and there are other very good regional groups, but this group was formed essentially just to focus on how do we grow jobs. And you heard from Lynley about the pressures of unemployment in our region. So we're a very small outfit, but we've got a very strong independent board, which is chaired by Steve Brack's former Premier, but it also has all of the leaders from the various large-scale employers across Melbourne's West. So I speak of Western Health, Victoria University. I talk about leaders from Lead West, which I mentioned at the introduction, the Western Bulldogs CEO, local businesses, and of course your very own CEO, Helen Morrissey of Brimbank, is also a member of our board. So we only have a small staff. I'm one of two part-time staff, and our primary objective is to try and influence new economic development opportunities for Melbourne's West. But to put it in very straight, crude terms, it's about creating more local jobs close to where people live and a greater diversity in the job opportunities for people in Melbourne's West. We've done this by releasing a number of reports where we use an economist and our board, and we do a bit of stakeholder discussion as well, just at a high level. We started in 2017 with an economic blueprint for Melbourne's West, but we've also released a number of other reports, and you'll notice that Sunshine Daring to be Great, which is one that we released about this time last year, created a lot of interest and discussion around the future of sunshine, which is exactly what WAmea exists for and exactly what we want to be doing, talking very positively about the opportunities in Melbourne's West and particularly in Brimbank. Moving on to the next slide, and that is to talk about this city deal. The city deal is essentially a policy creation of the federal government, the Morrison government. What it's designed to do is to bring three levels of government together with the community to work out a shared vision for productive and livable cities. I think I've lifted that straight off their website. You can tell it's government speak, but it's really about bringing the forces of three levels of government together. And what it's about is about sort of alignment around planning, investments, accelerating growth and job opportunity, and stimulating urban renewal and driving economic reforms. There has been 8 city deals done across Australia. Only one has been done in Victoria so far, and that's been done in Geelong. Had a high focus on tourism, including in Geelong and the Great Ocean Road as well. What it's done is it's brought $370 million worth of investment to that region. So when we're talking about city deals, we're talking about big bickies, because the most recent city deal that was done has been done in Perth, announced I think last month, worth about 1.5 billion, and a really high focus on universities' skills and bringing people into central Perth. So there are a number of phases to a city deal. Usually the first phase is essentially an MOU or a statement of intent between the three levels of government to move forward. Then there's usually a fairly long and extensive period of discussions with stakeholders, including many that would be on this forum today. And then once that is done, then you're into implementation by way of annual progress reports. And most city deals are 5, 10, in some cases up to 20 years long, depending on the breadth or investment involved in those city deals. Next slide, thanks, Brooke. The background to this has been fairly extensive. So there has been various delegations from Melbourne's West and North, up to Canberra, up to Spring Street, to talk about the importance of our growing area. We had a breakthrough in May last year when Minister Tudge, the federal minister, wrote to all of the local government and advocacy lead bodies in Melbourne's North and West, and basically said if they were elected again, they would seek to deliver a city deal in Melbourne's West. There have been a number of roundtables, as you would expect, just sort of to scope out how this would work. And that has triggered essentially a number of groups, which I'll explain shortly, to come together in Melbourne's North and West to try and work out how we would approach a city deal and what would be in it. I think it's probably worth noting the very last item on this particular slide indicates that just a week ago, Minister Tudge's office indicated that they intend on proceeding with a city deal with a hope to securing an agreement across all three levels of government in the first half of 2021. The reason that's significant is like everything else that's happened this year, COVID has really put a spanner in the works. So where we thought we might be proceeding at a more accelerated rate, they've had their focus elsewhere, as has the state government, as has local government. Important to note that city deals are very much alive and well, and there is an intention to move one forward in Melbourne's West. Next slide, Brooke. So governance, think about Melbourne's north and west. Think about how extraordinarily large Melbourne's north and west is and how quickly it's growing, and how hard it is potentially to get an alignment of views across all of the various groups that exist in Melbourne's north and west. What we did is we set up a steering committee and working party, which on the western side has involved WAmea, which I'm representing, Lead West, and I mentioned Sula Greca, and Victoria Universities. We thought we needed some champions. Every time Steve Brack speaks about something in Melbourne's West, it seems to make either the front page of the Herald Sun, or it's spoken about on radio all day, or it's on TV. So having people like Steve Bracks, John Brumby, who's the Chancellor at La Trobe University in Melbourne's North, and Senator Scott Ryan, who has his office in Melbourne's North and West, or Northwest in Many Ponds. Having people like that talk about our region in a really positive way has been quite critical, as I'll show you later on in relation to the launch of our work to date. Next slide goes to the scope of our work. Now, we have had worked intensively across 4 or 5 months to prepare a report. What that looked at is both the strengths and the challenges. So what are the things that are happening in Melbourne's West? Where are our competitive strengths? What infrastructure is coming to our region? What will that enable to happen when it's invested? We looked at all of the strengths and challenges in our area. Again, we want to paint a really positive view of what our region has to offer. So in thinking about the theme, and I talked about Geelong having a sort of a focus on the visitor economy, the 4 themes that our group across Melbourne's North and West believed that there was strong alignment were around a city deal that would focus on the future economy. It needs to be recognised that more people leave Melbourne's West, they commute to get work, than any other region of Melbourne or Victoria. That's a really big challenge. It means that lots and lots of people are working in Melbourne's West, and lots of people have skills in Melbourne's West and experience, but there's not enough local jobs in our region to basically cater for the population that's here today and the population that is growing over the next 20 years. In order for people to work and for people to invest and organisations to invest in Melbourne's West, you need to have good transport and connectivity. You need to not just be able to move people from Sunshine to the CBD, you need to be able to move them around Melbourne in multiple modes of transport. Yes, the airport rail link is really critical, but that's why suburban rail link and other investments are really important as well. Health and wellbeing, and also livability, things such as housing as well. The rationale for investment in this area is really about jobs and growing 300,000 jobs to match population growth. Our focus here is really around making Sunshine, Werribee, Footscray and Melton our economic beating hearts of Melbourne's West. They are the precincts that we want to grow, and we've listed both transformational and enabling projects that will bring those economic precincts to life. Next slide, and I'm conscious of time. Some of the big transformational projects that we're pushing in Melbourne's West are already happening or are in stages of going to happen. But Westgate Tunnel, notwithstanding its challenges, will be a vital second river crossing, very important for the freight industry. That will grow jobs. Melbourne Airport Rail Link. We're building the biggest hospital in the state in Footscray, and recently we also were pushing and were successful in getting another hospital to be built for Melton. There are a number of other projects there on the transformational list. I won't go through them all, but you can see them for yourself. Moving to Sunshine, which is a focus for us, Airport Rail Link and the Suburban Rail Link will absolutely transform Sunshine forever and, in fact, make it the capital of Melbourne's West, very much akin to Parramatta in Sydney. There is a need to significantly boost jobs in the local area, but also address the social disadvantage, diversify housing stock and address livability gaps such as open space and recreation. The City Deal proposal priorities for Sunshine beyond the rail, we did put St Albans Health and Wellbeing Hub. We see the strong benefit of that for the community. We want to create a jobs institute in Brimbank, and we want to create a very significant regional sports facility as well. Now, there are many other things that we could put in a city deal, but we've got to prioritise and spread the love across Melbourne's west and north. Next slide, just a couple to go. That's a map, essentially, where all of the projects are under our report. Next slide goes to the media in terms of the launch on the day when we release this. Front page, double page spread. Lots of interest in Melbourne's media about the growth and opportunities in Melbourne's west. The messages on the next slide are really about saying we have a very large and diverse population. 1 in 3 Victorians will live in Melbourne's north and west, and our area is expected to grow to be about bigger than South Australia over the next 20 years with 1 million extra residents. That's why we need 300,000 extra jobs. Just finally, the budgets, good outcomes in the budget, and it's no doubt that our city deal plan is already being recognised for including some important projects. I think that, as Lynley said, what you've got is setting the foundations for COVID recovery, but some regional outcomes of significance for Melbourne's west that come through, particularly from the state. Funding for land acquisition and early works for a new hospital in Melton, the redevelopment and expansion of the Whitten Oval in Footscray worth about 60 million. Richard Ponsford from Melbourne West Tourism will be very happy about the expansion of the Werribee Open Range Zoo, moving the elephants from Parkfield down to Werribee. It will generate new jobs and economic opportunity. There's a major new justice precinct coming in Werribee, almost 200 million for that. First stage of Werribee Western Rail plan, fast rail to Geelong. That'll go all the way through the west and create almost 3,000 jobs, 52 new mental health beds, and I'm sure Emma King will talk about the social housing dwellings, and Brimbank and Maribyrnong are priority areas out in our part of the world. It's an outstanding budget for Melbourne's west. Just the final slide is our next step. We're daring to be great at WAmea, and I know Brimbank is as well. Our time has come. And we've waited a long time, and sometimes it does take 20 years to be an overnight sensation, but it's our time now, and we're daring to be great and think big. We do want to secure more than $1 billion worth of new investment in this city deal for our region, and we do want to accelerate the delivery of major infrastructure and investment with a high focus on jobs, and we'll work closely with our partners to maximise every single opportunity for Melbourne's west. So, Jason, back to you.
We're going to hear now from Emma King from VCOS, and I expect that probably one of your key messages, Emma, picking up on some of what Wade has talked about, is that what's also outstanding about these budgets, particularly the state budget, is that there's such an incredibly strong equity lens that's placed over the top of what's been released at a state level. And so to that extent, it's not surprising that the West has been so well recognised, represented, and the needs in the West responded to. Emma King will also be known to most people in the room as the CEO of VCOS, the Victorian Council of Social Services, where she's held that role since 2013. Emma provides a strong voice of leadership and advocacy on a broad range of social justice issues for the community sector and the most disadvantaged folks within the Victorian community. Emma has previously been the CEO of Early Learning Australia and has an extensive background in the public sector and in workforce and education issues, also having worked as a Victorian policy advisor, as a teacher, and in a range of industrial and training roles at the Victorian Independent Education Union and the Finance Sector Union. Emma represents VCOS on a range of ministerial advisory groups and committees. She's also the chair of the Future Social Service Institute, president of the Farnham Street Neighbourhood Learning Centre, and a board member of Mental Health Victoria. Emma is a regular commentator on social affairs and justice issues, and we're really delighted to hear from you today, Emma, to provide a background and an overview on both of the budgets, particularly in terms of how they respond to some of the key social justice issues and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I should let folks know we had some challenges getting Emma into the Zoom call, so we're all super relieved, A, that you're here, and B, that we're about to hear from you. So welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much, Jason. And if also I can acknowledge Brooke for his patience as we were kind of going back and forth. I think in this day and age, every event comes with at least one IT challenge. And unfortunately for me today, it was me, as in unfortunately for everyone here, but I'm glad to be here. And kudos to the team at Brimbank who made that all possible with as limited sort of stress, etc. as possible. So a huge thank you from me. If I can begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we all meet on today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So if I can pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge other elders and Aboriginal people who are with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the other speakers today, having just heard Wade's presentation. And Lynley, I'm very sorry that I missed yours, but I'm looking forward to looking at the slides, etc. later as well. I might jump in, just because of time, I might just sort of jump straight into the slides that I've got here. What I might do, just if we start off on the next slide, Brooke, if that's okay. Brooke's also assisting me with all things IT, which is a far safer thing for everyone on this call. I wanted just to touch on this slide. I'll touch on this slide and the next one quickly, partly because, again, it's great, as I think Wade acknowledged, and as did Jason, there's so many friends on this call for whom I think you're really across this, and I suspect you'll have touched on it today in terms of what's happened with our economy, and just clearly seeing the impact of COVID at both a state and a national level. You'll have heard about this at length in the budget, and I think particularly looking at sort of, we're looking at what's happened to our economy, I guess the level of deficit and spending that we're heading into. So I think the cash deficit's going to hit about 37 billion this year, and then it's projected to go from, it'll be about 23 billion in 18-19 to about 155 billion in 23-24. And I just say that to illustrate actually what I see is significant investment. And a good friend to many of us, David Hayward, who's got the beautiful economic expertise and lens, whom I go to regularly for advice. One of the things David said, you know, at the outset of this is, you know, kind of don't be alarmed. We're actually at a point where interest rates are really low. The state budget is not like a household budget. It's very different in terms of the way the money is rolled over. But our debt is actually very low in comparison to international standards as well, which I think is really important to acknowledge. And one of the things, in terms of when we look at the broader commentary, what we're seeing here is we've got the Reserve Bank saying, actually now is the time to spend, and spend big. And I think the test is where you spend, and where you spend in terms of looking at the economy and the society and the well-being of everyone who lives there. And what we're seeing particularly in terms of the state budget is that significant investment into the well-being. And when we're looking at infrastructure projects, things like social housing, which I'll touch on in more detail, and those sort of infrastructure programs and the care programs that are actually a significant investment in our economy. So I just wanted to pick that up as well. If you could just jump to the next slide, that'd be great, Brooke. The next slide, when it comes up, bear with me, you might just have it. Oh yeah, beautiful. In terms of unemployment, I think this is something, again, that everyone on this call will be very highly attuned to. The slide here picks up you know, unemployment, underemployment and underutilisation rates. And we all know that's been pretty horrific and magnified in Victoria, in Melbourne, I should say, particularly central Melbourne, because of the stage 4 component. You know, one of the things as well, when we look at the issue, I think, around unemployment and underemployment, remembering that if you only work an hour a week, you're suddenly considered to be employed. So I think it's important to show the impact in this way. And I'll be interested to see the next set of data as it starts to play out, knowing that some industries are starting to reopen. And I think there's that significant divide. And being someone who at the moment is trying to get hold of a couple of tradespeople whom I know have got work like they've said they've never had before, compared to others who just can't pick up work, or they've been entirely displaced from their work. And I think the next slide, if we jump forward to that one, because it gives that picture around unemployment and underemployment and kind of who's been impacted and impacted the most. And I think we've heard lots of language around particularly the impact on women, the impact on, and that's being described in various ways, would be the pink recession or she-cession, etc. as well. But it's overwhelmingly young people as well as women, but then as well as people who are older as well. And these slides, what I'm mindful of is, in terms of when we look at these slides, they don't necessarily show that there's a lot of people who've left the workforce. So we know that once COVID hit, a number of people actually stopped looking for jobs. They either stopped or they were prevented from looking for employment because they had significant caring responsibilities. So we know with things like with homeschooling kids and all those sorts of things, that had a really big impact on people, as did the need to care for others. So if you're not able, if you've got someone who actually needs care or support, but that person wasn't able to enter your home, then you're having to take time off work or not look for work during that period as well. So I just wanted to frame that more generally. And I think it also helps frame why the Victorian government was framed as it has been in terms of looking at a jobs budget, because we know we've just got to really focus on how we stimulate the economy. It actually fits in really beautifully, I think, with the presentation that you just gave as well, Wade, in terms of looking at, when we look at some of the parts of our economy that I think have traditionally been overlooked and some of the places where people live and need to work, there's huge opportunity that comes in there. I think government's pretty optimistic, both state and federal, in terms of looking at the employment figures going forward. I guess they can't really be anything else, but even at looking at unemployment figures going forward in the budget papers, which is over 5%, it's still pretty high. It's all relative, but still pretty high. But nonetheless, looking at a jobs budget, making that a central feature, I think has been a really positive thing. I might jump forward to the next slide if I can. The headlines here, and I think certainly Wade touched on these, that Lynley may well have as well. In all honesty, I've been to a lot of budget lockups. I've never felt as excited as I did in the last budget in terms of looking at the announcements, the magnitude of the announcements, and I'll touch on each of them in a bit of detail. But also, I think the joining up component. So when we look at the fact that a number of announcements that I won't even touch on today, but I'll just mention briefly. But, some of the announcements in terms of looking at called communities, some of the announcements in looking at libraries, and the other parts of the ecosystem that is our community, and talks about, to me, about the well-being of every Victorian and every Victorian community. Normally they would have been a press release in and of themselves, and this year they didn't make it because there was so much else that was in there. So I'll talk to each of these as we kind of go through, but it was pretty phenomenal is what I can say. So we might jump to the next one, and then I'll kind of have a running sort of commentary as we go. But looking at the housing and homelessness package to begin with, when we look at the investment in social housing, all I can say is my state and territory colleagues around the country are looking at this saying, we can't, they would desperately love what we've got. I think one of the things that we know is if we were to have the federal government step up and kind of match it, would just be phenomenal. But keeping in mind that it was considered a very big announcement in the last election, and albeit we called it a down payment, quite rightly, of 1,000 public housing properties over 4 years in the last state budget. It speaks, and on the back of actually pretty much no new housing for many, many years in terms of social housing, to have 9,300 new community housing homes, and looking at the investment in social housing more broadly is significant. I think it's also significant that some of it is quite intentionally tagged for particular components of particular members of our community, so Aboriginal housing for people with mental illness, etc., and being very deliberate about that. There's also some priority areas in there, and I think one of the things that will be of interest to people on this call is knowing that there's still a lot that's up for discussion. So there's a lot of care, I think, around saying we're not just going to name everything up front, because it's kind of an easy thing to do, but I think we come back and pay the price. There's kind of allocations in areas, knowing there's 25% in regional Victoria, but in terms of looking more broadly, there's some very specific initial allocation areas, but there is room for much more conversation about where there is real need. I know there's a lot of commentary at the moment, actually, in terms of looking at the hotel accommodation. Some of that's a bit tricky, for want of a better term, but what I would recognise is the intent around moving people into long-term permanent housing, because that is critically important. And inevitably, when we move into the stage of, the implementation stage, there's often challenges that are attached to that. But nonetheless, it's going to be worth us working through those. And I think we will all have to work through those together, because this is actually about moving people who are homeless or in incredibly tenuous housing situations into having a home, into having somewhere that's safe, affordable, appropriate to live. And that is fantastic. And the other thing I would really like to call out, because it's been significant, and we have worked closely with Minister Horn around the emergency rental measures. Absolute kudos to government on this one, because again, the fact that they've been extended through to March, potentially April for next year, that's been pretty phenomenal. Now we know we're going to have to keep a really close eye on that with Jobseeker and JobKeeper, etc., in terms of whether there needs to be a further extension. But I do want to really recognise that, because I think with the magnitude of the big housing build, it's easy to overlook that. But we know we've got more people renting than who've ever rented before, and the impact of the rental measures are really important. So if we could jump to the next slide. I am mindful of time, so I won't spend as long on each one, but I'm very excited about the housing package, I have to admit. Jobs and skills, again, I'll let people kind of have a quick look at this themselves rather than talking through everything in detail. One of the other things to note here as well, I think, is the pilot program for people who are employed casually to have access to 5 days sick or carers leave a year. One of the things that we all know is that COVID has absolutely magnified where there are areas of inequality. It's magnified issues, for example, if you're working in aged care or if you're working in disability and you're having to potentially hold down work in maybe 5 different workplaces in order to be able to get enough hours and to be able to pay your bills. That's something we're actually going to have to really address moving forward. And it's unfortunate that I think that a pandemic has lifted it to the level of attention that it's always deserved. But as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the key things we've seen here is that significant investment in jobs, in wage subsidies, etc. For a number of the things that you're looking at here, again, I think there's still a lot of work, understandably, to be done in the implementation stage. And I'm pretty excited about what that will look like. And looking again how it tags in with the presentation that Wade just gave, to think, well, actually, how does this kind of help us tag in where there's particular opportunities in particular communities? How do we actually go towards making all of these things join up? And there's enormous opportunity in there, and enormous opportunity, I think, in that sort of that recovery workforce, particularly, and from my end as well, I'm really looking at community services. They're jobs that can't be automated. They're jobs we're all going to need, and we're going to need more of, but also knowing that for some of the construction jobs, I'm thrilled that actually they've gone to areas such as social housing. And there's also some procurement, and again, call out to Wade on this one, who I know has done an awful lot of work in that sort of procurement space, very clear targets around, for example, having women employed in apprenticeships and those sorts of things. So, but acknowledging that that hasn't happened yet. So there's a bit of work to be done to make that happen, but really a call out on that one. I'll jump to the next slide, and I'm just going to have a quick look at time, so I might need to move it along a bit. Free Kinder in 2020 is phenomenal. The new funding model for students with disability is incredible in terms of it's actually going to double a number of students who can get support in the classroom and pick up many students who currently miss out because they don't meet particular criteria. So therefore they're knocked out of getting assistance altogether. This is, having worked in this space previously, when I saw the detail of this announcement, it's actually phenomenal and possibly much better than a number of people currently realise. It's a very strong strength-based model, and it's going to provide assistance to a number of children who currently miss out on support. I won't go into that in detail just because of the timing, but it is it's something to keep an eye on, because we know when we look at schools and early learning, basically we know if a student starts school and they are behind, it is almost impossible for them to catch up without significant intervention. So this is a huge announcement on top of the 3-year-old kinder, 4-year-old kinder, and then looking at the assistance for kids with disability as well. So I'll jump to the next one, but I'm, again, another one I'm really excited about. It's actually hard to not be excited about most of this, to be honest. Health and mental health. People would be aware that we've got the Royal Commission into Mental Health that's being handed down soon. So the government's already committed to funding that. A huge mental health package that's been delivered as a response to the interim report of the Royal Commission, but we know there's much more to come here. There's other components in here that, again, I'm mindful of time, I won't jump into, but again, pretty significant investments in mental health, knowing that there's more to come. And I'm mindful, given that we've just had a budget in November, we've got another one coming in May. I would expect to see much more for mental health as well coming in the May budget. I might move forward to the next one. Thank you. Children and families. Again, this was an interesting example of another one that in any normal year, the first dot point here would have been a pretty huge press release in and of itself, and yet it wasn't in the pack, I don't think, on budget day, because it was just such a big budget. But knowing that, and it is a great article that Jill Topsfield had in the paper today, and Liana Buchanan released a report yesterday around the number of kids who exit sort of foster care or resi care type arrangements and actually end up in our justice system, or end up unemployed, end up homeless, etc. This is a pretty phenomenal announcement around the Home Stretch campaign and allowing young people to stay with their existing foster, parents or kinship sort of arrangements up to 21 years. I think that's going to provide an awful amount of a great amount of scaffolding. Another one I'm personally very excited about, but I'm kind of keen to look at this one in a bit more detail and potentially ramp it up. The Get Active Kids voucher. I just think it's so wrong that basically you get to pay sport if you've got enough money to be able to pay, and if you don't, you miss out. It's such a strong strengths-based component. So I am looking at the figures, to be honest, around here. I'm thinking right back when the EMA existed, I know there was about 250,000 students who were on the EMA at the time, and we've had significant growth. I'm keen to look at the numbers here in a bit more detail, because we want to make sure these vouchers get to every kid who needs them. I won't touch on everything else because it's there, other than the ACCOs is really important in terms of looking at that importance of Aboriginal assistance for Aboriginal children and our Aboriginal population, and that connection back to ACCOs and that connection to country, etc., as well, is really important. I might just jump through quickly the next ones. Energy efficiency. It's actually quite hard, I have to say, to truncate this because there is so much in there. I am assuming people on the call are probably across a lot of this, but again, I said to the Minister when we got the little shout out about this one beforehand, one of the really nice things about this announcement, and kudos to the Minister, because it's pretty tricky, I think, to get all of these things up together. This knits back in really neatly with a social housing announcement, because the social housing properties that will be built are 7-star efficiency. Plus, we know with existing homes that one of the biggest issues we have is around the cost of energy. We've got people who are presenting to hospitals that are close to dying in winter because they haven't turned their heater on. They're so worried about what the cost is. And the need for us to make sure that people can access affordable heating and cooling is really important. So these announcements around for existing social housing properties, the energy efficiency upgrades, plus that replacing old heaters with efficient reverse cycle conditioners is a really good one, as is a solar panel rebates and the power saving bonus for Victorian households for people who are more vulnerable, acknowledging there's people who miss out there. So if you look at, for example, young people, people who are on temporary protection visas, etc., for a raft of reasons they miss out. But I'll jump through this one. But again, just wanting to call out the energy efficiency component. Federal budget, I have to say, I think there's a really interesting contrast to me between the state and the federal budget, in that the state went really hard into looking at the Victorian community and the well-being of the Victorian community. The federal budget, the biggest call out for me is around Jobseeker, and the fact that there still is no permanent increase to the Jobseeker payment. And we've got the coronavirus supplement being reduced again in January. This, I think, is something that everyone on this call will be acutely aware of in terms of looking at the number of people who are going to need a hand. And when the coronavirus supplement was at its highest level, what we saw was actually people who are on Jobseeker for the first time being able to afford food, being able to afford medicine, and also putting their money straight back into the economy because they've got such a small amount of money. They're investing it immediately into necessary things, but straight back into the economy. So A, it was a great thing for them because they weren't living in abject poverty, but B, it was stimulating the economy at the same time. The contrast, I think, in terms of no investment in social housing, early childhood and care, those sorts of things, and that support for people on temporary visas isn't there. The wage subsidies for people under 35 and that sort of Jobmaker announcement is an interesting one. There's concerns that I have around, well, what about if you're over 35, but also potentially displacing people in existing roles? It's something I'm quite concerned about. I think we'll need to see as that pays out. I'll jump to the next slide. I think it touches on equal pay funding a little bit more as well. There's a bit more around jobs and income, which I'll just touch on there. I think I might have mentioned most of these as well. Probably my biggest personal bugbear is around personal tax cuts being brought forward. So if you're going to look at, kind of goes to the point I made at the start about you invest where it matters. And I think it's the interesting choice that, and knowing they're at different levels, if you like, in terms of state and federal government, but it's an interesting choice for a government to make, to say, well, actually, rather than helping people who are doing it tough, particularly during COVID, we're actually going to give tax cuts to people who are doing fine. And I think that is a really strong show around where priorities are, to be perfectly frank. And I think when you look at the winding back of supports, etc., it just speaks to that part around governments fund what they value, and we can see that that shift. Might jump to the next one. Community services, equal remuneration order. Everyone I think on this call will be acutely aware of that. That was a real concern for us in terms of looking at contracts where this is pretty much falling off a cliff. You can see there who's been funded, who hasn't. So there's some good news stories in there, and there's still some unfinished work that we're going to need to look at. The other one is around cuts to services for people seeking asylum, which was one of those tricky ones that was hard to sort of find through the initial cut of the budget papers, but that's going to be pretty significant as well. I'll jump to the next one. I'm really mindful I'm running over time here. Health, telehealth, I think, is a good one. Again, keeping in mind of what that means for in terms of digital divide, but overall, and there's lots of unanswered questions around that. One we'll talk to for a while, but I think it's good that we've had a more recent announcement as well around telehealth and the continuation of telehealth and some funding there around mental health. Perhaps if you jump forward to the next one as well. Next steps. So next steps, budget in May. So pretty quick turnaround in terms of looking at budget in May. And I'd also just call out the fact that if you're interested in the greater detail in each of the state budget announcements, we've done a detailed analysis, and you can jump onto the VCOS website and have a look at the more detailed analysis for any of those. We've looked at the things that kind of don't make the headlines on budget day, as well as those that do, and having undertaken an analysis there, which anyone's welcome to jump on and look at. And we're about to start our state budget consultation, I think next week, if not the week after, for the May budget as well. So apologies, I think I've gone slightly over, Jason, but I'll hand back to you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Emma. Wade, perhaps starting with you, there's a bunch of questions that have come through on Slido. You made reference in your presentation to livability being one of the key dimensions of the work that WAmea's looking at. And there are a number of questions in the Slido format that are asking about that balance between some of the positive and the less positive effects of development in the Western region, and how some of these development opportunities are seeking to strike an effective balance, particularly around some of the poorer, the potential for economic, environmental outcomes. As well as what opportunities there are for community-led and community input into the shape that these development opportunities are taking.
Yeah, look, I suppose our starting point in relation to livability is if you want to grow jobs in a local area and you want to have a diversity of jobs, you've also got to have places where people will want to work. And there needs to be a recognition that for all of us, there's things that we love about where we live, and there's things that frustrate the hell out of us because it's different to what we've seen elsewhere. So when we talk about livability, we're really talking about sort of urban design features, streetscapes, lovely green canopies in our neighbourhoods, open spaces, the environmental aspects that are so important. It was lovely to hear Emma talk about sort of the 7-star sort of energy rating on housing stock. It's about diversity of housing. It's not pushing it's about having a community where everyone feels welcome. That's really what we're talking about in terms of building livable suburbs. And where does that come from? It often comes from local government level, who are closest to the people, who are listening to the various groups, who are often doing a lot of voluntary work to improve the livability of their own community, and often looking for a supplementation by way of financial support to improve component parts of their community. So I suppose from WAmea's point of view, whilst we don't dig right down into sort of the street-by-street livability aspects right across the entire Western region, what we're really saying when we talk to 3 levels of government is the investments that you will make, the jobs that will grow in particular areas like Sunshine, there is component parts of our economic centres that we will look to, such as open space, streetscape, urban design, diversity of housing, transport connectivity, all of those things which give a vibrance about our local economic hubs, that people not only want to work there, they want to live there as well. So when we talk about livability, Jason, it's really in those very broad terms. We don't want communities to be dormant. We don't want communities to be good for some and not everyone. So it's really about bringing a recognition to those areas. I hope that sort of broadly answers the question. There is a section on livability in the report, the proposal, and I've given the website there that people can access and read about that if they want some more information.
Well, thank you, Wade. And perhaps just sticking with you for a minute, you talked a couple of times there about employment as well, and there was a question, somebody referenced your comments about people in the West often leaving the West for work. Have you also looked at the numbers of people who are coming into the West for work and where there's a mismatch between available skills and available positions?
Well, it's just such a brilliant question. We have looked at this, and again, if people want to have a look at our website and go to our 2017 report, we actually give some data sets. Some of the really big sort of gaps are that we have about 50,000 workers in Melbourne's West working in sort of professional services, sort of white-collar jobs, perhaps at the higher income level. We have a disproportionately low level of those jobs available in Melbourne's West. So again, it's not to call out one industry over another, because all industries are important in terms of the future growth, and social services and health and education are going to be some of the big areas of growth. But, you know, when we're talking about putting an airport rail link or suburban rail through Sunshine, suddenly private developers are wanting to come and talk about building offices for professional workers in Sunshine. And that's not to mean that Sunshine's suddenly going to change its face overnight, but it is about bringing a diversity of job opportunities so that when the next generation of people moving into the West or young people are being educated in the West are looking at their job options, they can actually have a greater choice than they've had to now. So it's really a recognition that we do have people in the West that are already working in particular areas, and professional services is one of those areas, but they're actually travelling out of Melbourne's West to get employment. We want to bring more of those jobs. In order to do that, we've got to attract employers to want to invest, and they're already looking very seriously at Sunshine in particular, because the fact that there'll be a mass capacity to move people in and out of that economic precinct.
Great.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Emma, I wonder if you had comments to make in relation to the employment picture, particularly in Brimbank and the West. You touched a bit on the impacts of COVID, particularly for women and for younger people, and the fact that the state budget brought particular attention to young people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. What are your thoughts about the economic opportunities arising out of the budgets for Brimbank?
Oh, I would imagine, I suspect Wade and others on this call are probably already onto this actually, in terms of looking at where people have been particularly impacted. And we know in terms of looking at Brimbank, for example, when we look at the data in terms of unemployment and that sort of that local data, and also the data actually on poverty, and we've got our poverty maps online if anyone wanted to jump on those and have a look as well. it just shows where we need that really targeted support. And I think for me, one of the reasons we did the poverty maps going back a little while, it was to show the local characteristics of each area, and actually particularly looking at the importance of organisation or entities such as local government, to say, well, there are some things that are systematic, such as Jobseeker and JobKeeper, etc. There are others that are local, and we need to understand the local characteristics of each area. When you jump onto the poverty maps, they're sort of interactive. There's other new, iterations that have come out actually with some more recent data as well. But it's about actually tailoring responses to the needs of communities. And I do think we've got this particular opportunity right now by virtue of things that are happening at a state and a federal level, but joining them up really tightly with that local need. So yeah, broad systemic issues, but also looking at actually what are some of the things that we need to do at a local level in terms of understanding the local need. And the data's there and it speaks for itself. And when you look at the work that everyone on this call is doing, I think that's going to be quite pointed in terms of some of the effects that need to or some of the action that needs to be taken from here as well.
Lovely, thank you. And you've touched on this in the chat in Zoom. One of the really important factors in setting up a good start to life in education and ultimately employment is access to early education. There was a question about access to 4-year-old kinder. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Emma?
Yes, just to flag, the question was around 4-year-old kinder, and I think the certainty, which would be both for services, kinders, and also for families and guardians, etc. One of the challenges we've got in 4-year-old kinder is that the 15 hours of funded 4-year-old kinder is subject to a national partnership agreement, and it doesn't seem to matter which colour of politics is in at a state level. Trying to lock in that national partnership agreement, often for longer than 12 months, let alone in advance, is an enormous challenge. So just to answer that question really directly, that's been a problem forever. And it brings a huge amount of pain, actually, when it comes to services who are trying to provide in advance around how do you give families the certainty, etc., that they need. It always seems to get there, but gee, sometimes it's been pretty damn late, and it makes it really hard for services that are planning around how they, the services that they'll provide going forward. So at the same time, I would call out the free kinder component because I think that's critically important. And the need, one of the things that strikes me, and I know the 3-year-old kinder is being rolled out in different areas, and I can't recall off the top of my head whether Brimbank is one for next year, but we know that high quality early childhood education just makes a transformational difference to a young person's life trajectory, whether it's about health, whether it's about their economic participation, etc. And one of the things that often gets focused on around early childhood education is, well, it's great because it lets primarily mums work. Yep, that's good, but actually it's amazing for kids and their long-term trajectory. And I feel like that often gets overlooked, and the value of that is often overlooked. So slight extension in my answer, Jason, but it's something I think is so critically important.
Thank you, Emma. I'm so mindful of the time and wanting to provide a little bit of space for people to have a break before we delve in a little bit more detail into discussion in the topic areas. Perhaps to throw to both of you, we have a number of folks on the call who are local residents in the Brimbank area or are working in NGOs and other organisations servicing the Brimbank area. From each of your perspectives, what are the kind of lead opportunities for people to be engaging with what's come out of the state budget, really to improve experience and access for people in the Brimbank area? I know that's a tough question because there's so much there, but some really high impact opportunities that folks might engage with.
I might go first and give Emma the last word. It's terrific to be co-presenting with Emma today because they do such great work right across Victoria, and much of what we're seeing in the budget comes from the advocacy of VCOS. They always bring evidence to the table, so it's really lovely to be co-presenting with Emma. But I did want to say, look, think about an airport rail link as not just a stop in sunshine. It's a jobs corridor for 10 years. it's really hard to get $10 billion worth of project actually happening. And once upon a time, $10 billion for infrastructure used to be the totality of the budget in terms of all of its infrastructure. Think about that airport rail link as a jobs corridor that's coming through Melbourne's west. And then think about the fact that the Victorian government now has a requirement that anyone who wants to build that airport rail link must provide a procurement plan in terms of its delivery, which delivers social impact. There's a great project that I've looked at over in the UK. It was an upgrade of a sewer line, not a particularly attractive project, I know, in London, over 25 kilometres. And part of the legacy of that project was that workers were drawn from the postcodes in which that sewer line ran, and it ran through some pretty disadvantaged areas. I think there's a wonderful opportunity through Brimbank's leadership, WAmea, and I know VCOS supports the social procurement aspects of the Victorian government, to look at a jobs corridor project like Airport Rail Link. Yes, it will create opportunities for Sunshine and Brimbank, but why not think about it as having some requirements about drawing opportunities out for workers who are looking for work, not just in Brimbank but across Melbourne's west. I think that's a really great centrepiece, which is can be extended into areas such as the one that Emma talked about in terms of social housing. There's so much in this budget, as Emma said, that there's so much work still to do to resolve how the budget will actually roll out, that one of the things we've got to keep in our mind is how does the West always be front and centre in the conversations to accelerate the opportunities in Melbourne's West. And that's where the advocacy of all of you involved in this discussion, and Brimbank and Lead West and other organisations such as WAmea, will be really important to make sure that none of this investment is delayed in any way, because it's been a long time coming, and I'm sure Emma will agree with that.
Thank you, Wade. And as you talked about, Emma, it's barely 5 or 6 months until we have the next round of budgets to come too. So your thoughts?
Thank you. And thank you, Wade, for your incredibly kind words. And I have to say kudos to Wade for everything he did, particularly as a minister, to make, actually in the leading work to make this happen as well. And to everyone on this call, because Wade's point around that traditional underinvestment in the West, it's profound. And this is our chance to actually redress some of that imbalance. The other thing that I would so 2 things I'd want to call out. One is around some of that, sort of that community ecosystem there, where I think there's enormous opportunity where there's investment, be it in public libraries or parks, those sorts of things that we know they're kind of the knitting that often hold the communities together. So just to add that in addition to the points that Wade made. And the other thing that we're really calling for looking forward is a wellbeing budget, because really, if you've got, well, actually, I know this has just changed, but we've always sort of said, you can have a AAA credit rating, but if you've got a AAA credit rating and 100,000 people who are on a waiting list for a house, what does that mean about your society? So for me, I'm pretty keen to look at actually if you look at each sort of slice of government that often operates in silos, for them to be reporting back against, how are they delivering to the wellbeing of every Victorian and every Victorian community? I think that's really important, and we're having some pretty good conversations about that now. And I think it would be great to join with everyone on this call to kind of say, well, actually, how do we deliver for wellbeing for everyone who is in the Brimbank, the broader West and North communities? How do we deliver? So if, for example, if we're looking at an infrastructure project, how does that deliver towards wellbeing, and having governments report, accordingly, as they do in New Zealand, and looking at what happens in Scotland and Iceland and other areas. I just think we've got this real moment, ironically, that's come through a pandemic and come through enormous hardship. How do we take that? And actually, to be candid, I think it's created opportunities we would not have had otherwise.
Right. And there's a great silver lining to an otherwise dreadful experience, and highlighting not a particularly new experience either. That's been long-running equity issues. So much richness in that discussion. We could continue talking for hours, but some really valuable insights from both of you to set us up for the next phase of our discussion today. If everyone can join me in virtually thanking Emma and Wade, both of you, for your contribution today. That's been really super exceptional and helpful. Thank you very much for your time, and both have a very lovely afternoon.